morning, church. We are so happy that you are here with us. If you can please stand and join us to sing. I am holding on to faith, 'cause I know you'll make a way. I don't always understand, I don't always get to see, but I will believe it, I will believe it. You make mountains move, you make giants fall, you use songs of praise to kick prison walls, and I will speak to my fear, I will preach to my doubt. You were faithful then, you'll be faithful now. I am standing on your word, calling heaven down to earth. You will find my enemies, this will end in victory. I will believe it, yes, I will believe it. You make mountains move, you make giants fall, you use songs of praise to shake prison walls, and I will speak to my fear, I will preach to my doubt. You were faithful then, you'll be faithful now. Oh, you were faithful then, you'll be faithful now. And I know that I know you never fail, and I know that I know you never will. Fail, and I know that I know you never will. You make mountains move, you make giants fall, you use songs of praise to shake prison walls, and I will speak to my fear, I will preach to my doubt. You were faithful then, you'll be faithful now. Oh, you make mountains move, you make giants fall, you use songs of praise to shake prison walls, and I will speak to my fear, I will preach to my doubt. You were faithful then, you'll be faithful now. Oh, you were faithful then, you'll be faithful now. Raise a hallelujah in the presence of my enemies. I raise a hallelujah louder than the unbelief. I raise a hallelujah. My weapon is a melody. I raise a hallelujah. Heaven comes to fight for me, and I'm gonna sing in the middle of the storm. Louder and louder, you're gonna hear my praises roar.
hope will arise. Death is defeated, the King is alive.
Sing a little louder.
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 Oh, sing a little louder.
Sing a little louder.
In the presence of my enemies.
Sing a little louder.
Louder than the unbelief.
Sing a little louder.
Good morning. Welcome to Encounter Church. My name is Chris Causey. I'm the pastor here, and I hope you had an incredible Thanksgiving week celebration. I hope you ate too much, slept too much. I hope it was awesome. I love Thanksgiving. In fact, you don't get this by not being excited about Thanksgiving. And so it's like one of my favorite days of the year. So I hope you enjoyed it too. Today I get the privilege of wrapping up a series that Dallas and I kicked off earlier in this month called It's Fine. And it's really like kind of leaning into this idea of like, what do we do? How do we manage? Sometimes life can just feel a little overwhelming, and some of the kind of healthier rhythms of emotional kind of life can get out of sort, and we start using the phrase, it's fine, it's fine. And I don't know about you, but I've been married longer than a day, and I know that the word "it's fine" means it's never fine, right? If someone's like, "No, it's fine," you're like, "I don't think it's fine. I think it's probably not fine," and you're using "it's fine" to communicate that it's not fine, right? We smuggle in a lot into the phrase "it's fine." And what I want to do today, in kind of attempting to wrap up this series, is deal with probably one of the most difficult things to kind of press into when we come into this "it's fine" topic. It's, in some ways, metaphorically speaking, it's a lot like the Navy's greatest enemy. The Navy's greatest enemy isn't something shooting missiles or torpedoes out of submarines. One of the most costly, insidious kind of adversary the Navy faces is war and barnacles. In fact, billions of dollars a year are spent on dealing with barnacles. This is not a new problem. This is a photo literally from 100 years ago of them scraping off barnacles. And surprisingly, barnacles are not just kind of an ancient adversary of ships, but they're still that current problem. And there's a lot of money being poured into research trying to figure out how do we stop barnacles from sticking to ships. These little tiny things have an ability about 1 millimeter, and they can affix to the bottom of a boat going about 10, 15 miles per hour. And within 6 months, enough of these things can grow that they can literally slow a cargo ship or a destroyer down by a few miles per hour and cause it to burn more fuel than it needs to. Think about it. This tiny little thing has the capacity to take a floating skyscraper and slow it down going through the water. It costs the economy billions of dollars a year in lost fuel expense. And so, in some ways, I think the barnacle is a fitting picture of this figurative barnacle emotionally that builds up in our life. And it's one that our culture's not very good at talking about. It's one that our culture's not very good at dealing with. But it was one that was actually something God really cared a lot about. And he put a lot of emphasis on it. And it's this idea of grief. Now, you showed up to church after Thanksgiving, so I'm assuming there's some special things about you. You've had enough protein and turkey to be able to handle a little bit more of an advanced lesson. But that you're also willing to maybe take notes, because today I want to process with you what it looks like to grieve. And here's the thing, this is why I'm doing this one on Sunday after Thanksgiving, because it's traditionally kind of a lower Sunday attendance-wise, is this is not a message that for 95% of you is going to be specifically relevant right now. You're not actively grieving something. But it is 100% relevant for your future. Every one of you will grieve. You will grieve multiple times over the course of your life. You will grieve significant things. You will grieve small things. You will grieve. And unless you know how to grieve well, some things can happen. See, I think there are two types of grief. There's bad grief, which is what the movie Encanto is about, all right? Like, bad grief is we don't talk about Bruno, right? And families who did not learn to grieve well, relationships, businesses that have not learned to grieve well, they all have Brunos, and they don't talk about them. And you probably experienced that this week. You're sitting at a Thanksgiving table, and there's a chair empty, and nobody wants to talk about that chair that's not there. And so this idea of bad grief looks like the movie Encanto. And we avoid Bruno, even though Bruno's literally in the house with us. But there's also good grief. And good grief is the type of grief that God desired for us to learn how to practice. It's something that we have to do. It's a process. Grief is deeply personal, but it is universal. And none of us can make it through this life without having to do it. And the reason that there's a bad grief and there's a good grief is really because there are actually two types of pain. There is a pain that leads to more pain, and that's what bad grief is. It's pain that leads to more pain. Self-medicating pain, where we're dealing with this issue, but we don't want to address this issue, so we find relief somewhere else. Instead of going through it, we run away from it. And there is pain that leads to more pain. But there is a different type of pain, and this is what categorizes good grief. It's the pain that leads to healing. Every surgical moment you have in your life, you're going to be placed on a table, and a doctor is going to intentionally cause your body pain. They're going to do things. They're going to cut you. And the goal isn't to harm you. It's to facilitate healing. And good grief is that type of pain. And you and I have a choice, actually. We may not have chosen the thing that caused the grief in our lives. But you and I have a choice of what type of grief, what type of pain we're going to walk with and walk through. So if you're a note taker, or you're somebody who's like, okay, I get it. I don't want to be stuck in the movie Encanto. All right? I want to know how to go. This is a message you want to take notes on. This is a message that you're going to want to pull back out like a fire alarm, where if it ever happens to you, you break the glass and you reach in and you grab it. Because I promise you, what we're about to walk through, the steps, the understanding, can be powerfully liberating and helpful for you when you grieve, whether it's in the small or whether it's in the significant. Because grief is just a process. And that grief oftentimes will be attached to what we're going to look at today, which is a funeral moment, or it can be found in moments where the relationship doesn't work out. You thought they were the one, and they broke your heart. Or you thought you were going to get that job, and it didn't. Or you thought your relationship with your child would look like this, and it turns out like that. Grief is applicable to all of those things. And the principles and the practices and the paradigm I want to give you today is applicable to all those things as well. To kind of dive into this topic, I want to take you to a story written intentionally, I think, by John, because as I've said multiple times over the last month, John had a perspective that few other disciples had. He had a really close relationship with Jesus, but he also was the leader of the Christian church when the second generation started to kind of grow up. You see, Matthew, Mark, and Luke write their biographical accounts on the life of Jesus to the church that had no second generation Christians. Everybody who had come into the church had previously grown up in a different religion. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are addressing a lot of those kind of core ideas, a lot of core struggles, helping people understand, hey, I knew you grew up in this faith or this faith system, but this is what Christianity looks like. John comes along, and John is he was the youngest of all the disciples. He's the last of the original 12 to die, and he actually gets to be over and in the church when kids of the first generation were being born and were growing up. And these kids had experienced nothing but the Christian faith. And John had a unique perspective. He realized, man, the first generation needed certain things, but this next generation needs a whole different layer of learning. So he writes the book of John with the understanding that there's a second generation of Christians that he can build upon what's already been laid out through Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so he adds stories, he gives insight and details about Jesus that we don't find anywhere else. And gratefully for that, we have what's called John chapter 11. And John chapter 11 is the moment where Jesus shows up at the funeral of Lazarus, who was a good friend of his. So on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now means the funeral's done, right? Like people are like, it's over. Jesus had found out about Lazarus being sick days before he passed away. So about a week has gone by between Jesus hearing the news Lazarus is sick to when he finally arrives at the grave. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. And John gives you this piece of information because it's helpful to know that Bethany was a suburb of Jerusalem. And you see, a few weeks after this moment, specifically because of this moment that's about to unfold, Jesus will be crucified. And so John's trying to connect the dots and say, hey, here's how this conspiracy to kill Jesus began. Here's how it crystallized. It crystallized because Jesus comes to the suburbs of Jerusalem and performs this incredible miracle with Lazarus. And people who have power in Jerusalem are present, hear about it. And they decide Jesus is now a threat to their power structure. So John's helping us understand some bigger dots that the first generation wouldn't have necessarily pieced together because they grew up in it. They understood the power structures. But the second generation and beyond, they're living in a different world. So John's helping them understand. And many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. So because of the proximity, it meant there was huge crowds that had gathered at Mary and Martha's house. And when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Now, here's the crazy thing about the Bible. I said that it was written 2,000 years ago. This specific thing is almost 2,000 years ago. But the Christian faith comes out of the promises of the Jewish faith. There was 2 central promises in the Jewish faith, the promised land and the promised one. If you wanted to reduce all of what we would call the Old Testament down to 2 sentences, that is it. God has made a promise of land, and he's made a promise to send someone. The promised land, Israel, is fulfilled, and the second half of what we call the Old Testament is focused primarily on the promised one who is coming. Christianity comes out of that belief, comes out of that fulfillment of the promised one. We believe Jesus was the promised one in the Old Testament, prophesied and predicted. And so there's this deeply Jewish nature to most of the Bible. And that as people 2,000 years separated from kind of ancient Jewish culture, we can sometimes miss it. Sometimes the things we miss may not necessarily be earth-shattering or life-changing, but in this situation, it is. You see, in this simple kind of text, there is a terrain to it that's rooted in the Jewish culture that you and I would absolutely 100% miss. But if we're going to have a conversation about what it looks like around grief, we have to see it. So I want to kind of give you the backdrop of what's playing out here. So where you grieve is really important when you're walking through grief. Who you grieve with is incredibly important. Grief is a biological, mental, emotional, spiritual process. And because it is biological, because it is rooted neurochemically in your brain, that means there are some prerequisites for your body to be able to grieve properly. The Jewish people understood that. God understood that. That's why there were certain parts of the Jewish culture that facilitated these prerequisites really beautifully. And this passage is pointing to that. So, where to grieve? The first thing is validation. And this is present in the text. They lose their brother. And literally the city of Jerusalem has come out to stand with them. And this is something that most of us don't think about when it comes to grief, but we've all experienced it. Maybe you're processing a breakup, or maybe you lost that job that you thought was your dream job, and you're talking to a friend and they say something like, "Are you still upset about that? You haven't moved on from him yet? You haven't gotten over her? That was a year ago. Why are you still talking about this?" Or maybe you heard this growing up. Oh, you're crying. I'll give you something to cry about. Right? We grow up sometimes in a culture, and what we don't realize is that validation is powerful if we're going to grieve properly. To have someone look at you and say, "I can't even begin to imagine how heartbreaking it must have been to have lost that job. I know how excited you were. I remember the day you got the letter." Like, this validation thing is incredibly significant. And it's present in the text. Them being present with Martha and Mary. Yes, it's a funeral. Yes, you're like, well, that's easy. But I'm telling you, what they're doing is important for any grief. If you're a parent, I watch my wife do this beautifully with our kids. If you're a parent, validating your children's grief is essential. It doesn't, because oftentimes what happens is, right, like we're adults, to take our kids, for example, we're adults and we have real problems. We have real griefs. But, so you're like, what is it? You broke your toy. Big deal. Well, get over it. Stop crying. But if you had an accident and broke your car, you'd be sad. If your house snapped in two and a piece fell off, that'd mess with you. Right? So we have to be intentional about recognizing not what you think is valid, but understanding what they're walking through and giving voice to it. And by doing that, what happens is you actually create the safety, which is essential. The human body cannot grieve if you don't feel safe. People in the middle of war, they don't grieve what they're going through. They're just trying to get through it. So much of COVID, if you were to sit down and be like, "Oh, Chris, just talk about anything," and I actually want to listen for an hour, which nobody's going to do that. But if you did, I would connect so much of what we've experienced in the last few years in our world. Actually, I would even argue, you go back all the way back to 2016. I can walk you through history that we've walked through as a nation, and a lot of it has connections into bad grief. When a group of people don't feel valid, when a group of people don't feel validated in what they're feeling because no one's listening to them, don't be surprised what comes out of that. Like grief is a powerful force. It's either good grief or it's bad grief. It's going to be grief. And this safety, creating physical and emotional safety. I remember walking through one of the biggest kind of heartbreaks of my life. It was one of the biggest betrayals. I mean, probably hurt me more than any other kind of relational thing I'd ever went through. And I remember calling a mentor of mine. And I'd talked to him about it for a few times. And this was like 6 months after it happened. And I remember bringing it up. And he was like, "Are you still stuck on that?" You know what I never did again? I never, ever brought it up with him. Because he wasn't safe. It was real for me. It was gut-wrenching for me. But he wasn't safe. And if we're going to be people who grieve, you have to have a place where your grief can be validated. Where you can feel safe to bring that grief to the table. And they create space for you. And this was huge in the Bible. I mean, this is a Jeopardy thing. It may help you. If it does, just give us 10%. We'll call it even, right? And so, like, if you're ever on Jeopardy and they were like, what is the first book of the Bible? Not what's the first book that's written. That was the book of Genesis. But chronologically in history, which book occurred first? Because Genesis is a telling by Moses of creation, but there's a book that precedes it chronologically, and it's the book of Job. Job is the oldest chronological moment when you read through the Bible. And what is the first portion, the first few chapters of Job about? Job has experienced a deep grief, gut-wrenching grief. He's lost almost everything. And what happens? His friends show up and they sit with him and they say absolutely nothing. They weep, they Grubhub him food, they just sit present with him. They create space for Job to weep and to grieve the loss of his kids. This creating space is what these people do. They travel to Mary and Martha. 4 days have gone by since they buried him, and they are still there, sitting with Mary and Martha, giving them space to grieve. This may surprise you, but I'm a white guy, and one of the things that interests me is cultures and the different types of cultures. And one of the things that's always been fascinating to me about specifically like you've got European and then you got European descendant white people, which is most of America, right? The European descendant white people bury people really fast. Have you ever noticed that? Like somebody dies. Like in 2 or 3 days, they've put that body in the grave. And it's like the people are already flown back home 4 or 5 days later. But that's not the norm around the world. A lot of cultures, so I grew up in a town where I was the minority. And so, I had friends, African-American friends who lost loved ones. And so I kind of grew up with 2 different worlds of what funerals could look like. And so my friends who lost loved ones, when I would step into their homes, the body would sit there for a week. People would travel. They would grieve. They would eat together. They would tell stories. They would laugh. They would cry. And then I'd step over into this world, and there would be a funeral. It was like an hour before the funeral, you could come by and say, "I'm sorry" to the family. And then like right after that, they buried the body. And then it was like everybody left. And it was like people moved on. And this idea of creating space is present in this Jewish context where they're like literally just sitting. The book of Lamentations is a book of grief. The book of Psalms is a book of grief. It's filled with a lot of grief songs. The other thing is time. It's a biological process. Have you ever noticed, like, we would never do this to someone with a physical ailment. We'd never walk up and be like, "You're still limping with that broke leg? Come on now. Are you still having to check your blood sugar with this diabetes?" Like, we would understand, right, that there are some things that, like, time just is a process point of it. and we accept it. But for many of us, we've had moments where we've learned there's an unspoken rule about certain things that after a certain time, people don't want to hear about it anymore. You may still be walking with the heartache of what happened to you, but no one else thinks that you should still be carrying it. And they say things, it's not intended to be mean, but it hurts. And it shuts you down. And we get stuck in our grief because we have no place to go with it. Because they're like, are you still stuck on that? And I'm like, well, you know what? Losing a loved one is not something you're stuck to. It sticks with you. Like, your dreams falling apart that you dreamed about your entire life, that's not just something you get stuck in. I got to go dream a whole new life because I thought I'd figured it out. People walking through the divorce are like, he was a loser. Why are you still hung up over that? It's like, I don't know. Maybe I built a family that I thought was going to be forever, and it's not. And I'm trying to figure out, what do I do with that? I mean, this is why where you grieve is so important. And lastly, what you see is a full-out fledged piece of it's community. Community is around holding and supporting and loving. And this is why I think the church is so powerful. And if you don't have this in your life right now, this is so important, it's worth paying for. Because that's what counseling often is. Counseling is paying for having this in your life. This is why when we say, hey, you should step into a group at church, this is why. It doesn't mean you got to agree with everything. We don't say, hey, if you want to be in this group, sign this confessional statement, and if you ever veer out of it, somebody has permission to hit the lightning bolt or the seat that opens up and you fall through. Like, we haven't installed that yet. That's at least 2 years off, okay? Like, so you got time. But this is why. It's because you need that space. You need validation. You need to feel safe. You need the time. And you need the people. And fortunately, that's not all. That's just the backdrop. Let me give you the other half of this thing. Lord, so Martha runs out to Jesus. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Like, I told you a week ago he was sick. I asked you a week ago to come here because he was sick. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I'm 4 days removed from putting him in the tomb. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. Now, I love the Bible. But there are some times when I read passages, I'm like confused. And this is one of them. Because this feels schizophrenic. She's like, if you'd have been here, my brother would have died. But I know you can do anything you want. I mean, it's like, what is happening? It feels weird. It feels off. It feels like two different people almost. But here's the thing. There is another terrain in this text that if you didn't see it, if you don't know it, you just kind of, like me, are like, man, that's really weird. Why does she like lash out and then simultaneously like lift up? Man, anything you want to do, you can do it. And it's because what you see playing out in here, where Jesus says, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. This is a reference to something, a very deep part of Jewish theology that would later Christianity would build on when we talk about the afterlife. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? And she says, yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world. Like, in this section of Scripture, what you see that would have been obvious for anybody in the first century, but it's not obvious for us, is how to grieve. The first part gave us where to grieve, who to grieve around, like what's the prerequisites for grief to actually happen. What you see in this interchange is literally the process for grieving. So let me walk you through it. The Jewish people didn't use the word grieve, they used the word lament. That was their word. That's why there is a passage. There's a whole book in the Old Testament called Lamentations. It's literally the lamenting. The book of Psalms have this pattern built into it. And the first thing that you will notice in lamenting or grieving is this crying out to God. Now, she does this a week ahead of time. She sends word to Jesus. Hey, Lazarus, who you love. She adds that. She wants him. Jesus, remember, you love my brother. Like, we're good friends. He's dying. Can you come? She cries out. And then she does what's the very next step in the process of lamenting. She brings her complaints. This is why you see, out of nowhere, her opening statement. He would not have died if you'd been here. He'd still be alive. And some of us grew up with a faith that the God of your faith is not big enough to handle your honesty. It's as somehow some of us grew up with a picture of God who was brittle or who couldn't handle talking about Bruno. Maybe he's too old and feeble with some gray beard, like some kind of geriatric Santa Claus, who if you talk about hard things, he just kind of shuffles away. He knows everything. He knows what you're going through. He knows the pain that you're carrying. And he's big enough to handle your honesty. That's why you see in Psalms, people come to him and they're like, Lord, where are you? God, you've forsaken me. If you'd have been here, he'd still be alive. Man, I'm so grateful that we have a faith that can hold up to the heavy complaints that life brings sometimes. Man, I'm so grateful. We don't have a faith based in hype. We don't have Tony Robbins. Oh, you just got to pick yourself up and push on through and don't stop believing. Keep climbing, keep climbing. You'll eventually reach that mountain. You know the best view on any mountain is when you get to the top. And it's like, well, I don't want to climb this mountain, Tony. I want to take the little thing that takes you up on the cart and, brings you to the top. I'm tired. I don't want to keep grieving. I don't want to keep having hard things happen. I am so grateful that we have a faith, that the Christian faith can handle our heavy, honest, brutally raw, candid thoughts with God. And that's why in Psalms, you see people bring their complaints to God because he can take it. And what you see in those Psalms, in the process of lament, baked into Lamentations, present in the book of Psalms, present in the book of Job, very, very first chronological book is a book about grieving and lamenting because it's essential in a world that's broken. And this is why Martha and her conversation makes sense. She brings her complaint, and in the very next breath, she asks boldly. You see this in the Psalms. It's like, God, where are you? My enemies have encamped around me. And that's not like figurative enemies. That's not like metaphorical enemies. That's not like my Facebook enemies. That's not like my work enemies who might give me more work to do. These are actual enemies with swords, bows, and arrows who want to kill me. God, the enemies encamped around me. Deliver my enemies to me today in victory. I mean, it's this weird juxtaposition of crying out in complaints, but asking boldly. I mean, when we were walking through our infertility struggles, I mean, this is what I would do. I would cry out to him and be like, God, I'm not enough. God, I'm not enough. You got to hear me. You got to hear what I'm saying. I can't. In brutal honesty, this body is broken and I can't fix it. Like, I can put up with the baldness, God, but this? And then the very next breath, but you are the God who is able, if you choose. Please. And then, but even if you don't, I trust you. I trust you're big enough to carry me and what I will never have, or to hold me while I hold what I've always hoped to have. I mean, this is lamenting. This is it. Crying out to him. Being honest with him. But believing that he's able and asking boldly. And just trusting. And walking in that trust. That's what grieving looks like. And let me leave you with this. When Jesus saw her weeping, so he shows up to the grave. He sees Mary and Martha weeping. Okay, so what I just gave you is free counseling. All right? You will spend thousands of dollars getting what I just told you from a counselor. You're welcome. Okay? But this is what a counselor cannot give you. This is what only the counselor can give you, is what we're about to read. He sees the Jews who'd come along with her weeping, and he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. I love this passage. I can't even like say out loud, because I saw kids in the room. I can't even say out loud what captures this. Because what is actually playing out in the Greek text, what John writes about what he sees in Jesus, is an anger that is fiery, that is so deep. Like Jesus is so mad about what he sees. Why is he so mad? Why is he so angry? It's because he's the creator. He knew what he created us to be. He knew the world he created us to live in, and he's looking at this complete travesty and mockery of the world he made with this funeral procession, with these people grieving, because he never made us for a world with death. We made that world. We chose that world. And he's angry at the brokenness that he sees, which brings so much comfort. There is no amount of brokenness. There is no amount of anger, grief, frustration that you've ever experienced about the brokenness of life that ever even remotely comes close to the anger and the frustration he has about the brokenness in this life. Because he knows what it was supposed to be. And I'm so glad John puts this, that in the flash, right before we see him weep, John sees an anger that's burning with a fire that is hard to put into words. And then Jesus says, "Where have you laid him?" Well, that anger is still present. He asks, and they say, "Come and see, Lord." And it says, Jesus wept. Like, how crazy is it that the God who created the world, who created the universe that we are just beginning to peer into the vastness of it. Like, I'm teaching my son about the planet. And like I love the outer space and the universe, and like we're like a family of nerds. So when they sent the Mars rover up, you could actually put your name, you could like submit your name to NASA, and they would like print your name on a little chip that was put on the rover that roams around Mars. And so like last night, literally I pull up and I get out of my car and I look up and there's Mars, and my son can point to Mars. Like he's like, that's Mars, right? So like we're nerds. And so I'm looking and I'm like, my name's up there. Like I see Mars and I'm like, my name is on that planet. Like I conquered that planet. It's on a microchip. How cool is that? Like, and Mars is like remotely, like it's next door. It's not even like close to how big and vast this universe. The God who made all of that is weeping at his funeral. Like profound and personal does not capture it. It's beautiful. And the Jews say, see how he loved him. The craziness about this and who he is takes me back to barnacles. So, full disclosure, I read way too many articles about barnacles. But I read a fascinating article recently from some MIT researchers who had noticed, you know, these little 1 millimeter organisms are quite fascinating. A boat moving 15 miles per hour through the water, and this 1 little millimeter organism can affix itself with its forehead, and simultaneously, while in motion, can start to superglue its body in a way that is almost impossible to get off. And these MIT researchers were like, what if there's something amazing going on there? So they started studying it. And the studying it, they realized that there is this incredibly complex protein kind of play out coming out of the barnacle that allows it to push away moisture, to clear away debris, and then to form a cement that can literally slow down a boat that's not even like comparable to its size. And this unpacking ended up becoming the base for what they created that's hopefully going to go through FDA testing soon. You see, if you were to ever experience some type of trauma where you're bleeding out, like seconds matter when you're pouring blood in an emergency room. And most of the treatments we have to stop blood take minutes to kick in. And what they found is that this glue that was created from this, in 10 seconds, can bring a wound together and seal it and stop bleeding. It can literally save lives. And they're beginning to kind of test this out on animals, and the tests on animals have gone incredibly well. And there's a chance that one day you and I, hopefully not, but if we ever get in a car wreck or end up in the middle of something where there's a massive amount of blood being lost inside of our body, that you and I could have our lives saved because of a barnacle. And just that realization, seeing it from a different perspective, changed it. And I think when you look at this passage, when Jesus says, take away the stone, and they're like, by this time there's a bad odor. He's been there for 4 days. And Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know you've always heard me, but I say this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. And when he said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped in strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And I love this. This is like humorous to me. Jesus is like, Lazarus, come out. Because he's behind a stone. You got to scream. You can't whisper that. You ain't going to hear it. And so they move the stone and Lazarus walks out. And everybody is so stunned. They're so amazed that Jesus has to say to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Lazarus is like, can you help brother out? I'm sort of stuck in this thing, right? Like he's trapped. And Jesus is like, I know this is amazing, but can somebody help him? And I think the beauty of this story and what Jesus does goes beyond just the miracle of calling Lazarus out of the grave. Lazarus is one of the few people in human history who has the benefit, though, of 2 funerals. They buried him one time, and then they buried him again the second. So this story isn't about him calling Lazarus out of the grave, as amazing as that may be. This story was about people realizing who Jesus really was and what the power he had to really do. In the same way, when the MIT researchers shifted the way they thought about the barnacle, it changed how they saw it. When you understand who he is and what he is able to do, it changes how you see your circumstances. It changes how you see what you're walking through. When you realize that that's the God who has said, I will be with you, it changes how you walk through it with him. It changes how you grieve. It changes how you love. It changes how you forgive. It changes how you weep. It changes everything. Because you follow, if you're a Christ follower, the God of the resurrection, the one who calls out dead things and brings them to life. But it gives us ability to weep differently than the world. Because I love that he's promised that he'll be with me and he'll be with you no matter what you walk through. But that day when he said, Lazarus, come out, he was actually making a deeper point that would get really crystallized when he walked out of the grave himself. And it's that sin and death no longer had a hold on him, that no longer had the power to hold you, control you. We don't like to think about death. We don't like to talk about death. We, as a culture, do a really good job of extending life so that we can go 8 decades before statistically we're likely to die. And I think there's really good, obvious benefits to that. But one of the unintended consequences of life expectancy growing is that we can kind of live in denial that death is a reality for all of us. Like, nobody gets out of this room. Like, nobody in this room, nobody listening online is going to be the person who's like, woohoo, I didn't die. Every one of us will have a funeral. Every one of us. You may not have accepted that yet. You may have not have processed through that yet. You may have not even wanted to recognize that. But every one of us will have a funeral. And Jesus isn't just saying, I've come to bring hope in this life. He's come to bring hope. And his invitation for people to follow him, to turn to him, to trust and to confess what Martha said. Like, I know you're the Son of God. I know who you are is completely unique and distinct, and that what you did, what you've come to do, has the power to undo everything I've done before. Which is why ultimately, the best news about this story is not that I will be with you. Is that Jesus is like, look, even when all is finally over, you'll be with me. Which is a comfort. That there is nothing this world can do to you that can take that away from you. That's hope. That's a hope that gives us an ability to walk through. I mean, like, somebody was joking. They're like, oh, but you'll die. I'm like, look, my life is literally up and to the right if you zoom out enough. Like, it may have peaks and troughs, but where I'm headed, it's like if you've ever gone on a road trip and maybe your car has some issues or like your radio goes out, but where you're going, you're so excited about it. Or if you're on an airplane and you get delayed a few hours and you're okay with it because where you're going is worth the wait. It's worth the waiting and the walking. It's worth the running from gate to gate. Because where you're going can actually change how you think about getting there. I know when I breathe my last breath on this planet, I will be more alive then than I've ever been up until then. Like there's never going to be a day written about me where Chris is dead It's like, no, Chris just transitioned to a different place. Chris is in a better place. Like, I'm like totally dating myself, but like, I'm moving on up to the like east side. Got that deluxe apartment in the sky. And when that creeps and goes down deep, it changes. It changes how you grieve. It changes how you see the world. And it really can actually help you find and walk and be in a place that even when everything is not fine, for you to say, it's fine. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you. Thank you for your grace and your mercy and your love and the hope that we have in you. God, thank you for your text and how profoundly deep it is and how helpful it is to understanding grief. And thank you that you're a God who didn't give up on us even when we gave up on you. Thank you for you being present that day at Lazarus' funeral. Thank you for crying that day at Lazarus' funeral. Thank you for the moments where you have grieved over what we're grieving. That you're just as angry about we're walking through that we're angry about. Thank you for the promise that you're with us. But thank you, because of Christ, that even greater promise, that even when it's all over, we'll be with you. And so may you meet us, for those who are grieving, God, in this room, for those who are listening online. May you meet us in the midst of it. For those who are not grieving, God, may you, like those barnacles, cement this teaching into our hearts so that when we walk through it, that we would be able to practice good grief and not get stuck in the bad. And it's in your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen. So today we wanted to leave you with this song that for those who are grieving, to give you some space to actually do what we talked about. For some of you, you've been walking and carrying and navigating, and you just need to know that there's a God who's created space even in this service for you to be honest with him. And for some of you, maybe to be brutally honest with him. For some of you, to be able to meet with him and say, you know what? I'm going to keep trusting. I'm going to keep walking. I'm going to keep believing. In Psalm 126, verse 6, it says that those who go out sowing seeds with tears will come back carrying sheaves with joy. This idea that in him, good grief, that our very tears become the water that God grows things out of. Things that we could have never even imagined that he could grow. I talked about our infertility struggles. I've shared before, so I won't kind of go through the story. I'll just rehash that. Like, there was a point in our grief where I remember praying, doing that process, and writing down the name Christopher Henry Causey. And I have it. It's literally a picture in my phone and on my watch from January of 2016. And I wrote down, God, would you give me a son? And I was bold. I'm not joking about the boldness. And I wrote down Christopher Henry Causey, and I never told anyone, not even my wife. It just became this bold prayer request. And in 2019, we got pregnant. And long before we ever found out it was a boy or a girl, my son, like my daughter, declared that she was going to have a brother named Henry. And began to walk around the house proclaiming that 3 months into the pregnancy, to the point where it got awkward, where it was like, are we going to let this child name our son? And then one night in the bed, my wife kind of was like, hey, I've been thinking, I like Henry. And I had not given any commentary on the name. She was like, but I think it should be Christopher Henry Causey. And a few weeks ago, my wife and I were processing some grief because this is stuff we do. We were in a place that was safe, and we're working through some things, and it hit me. I was like, Jenny, I never realized there was only 1 month in all of our life where Christopher Henry could have been born. There's only 1 month where the biological requirements for that to happen could have happened. And it happened. And if you've ever met my son, he is Christopher Henry Causey in full 150% style. He is fully him. There's only 1 month in all of our life where he could have showed up. And God brought him in due time. I don't know what you're grieving, but I do know that if you go out sowing with tears, I can't tell you what will grow, but I can tell you something will. And this song is about that. This song gives voice to walking with that type of faith. And so I want to invite you to stand, or I want to invite you to sit. I want to invite you to cry. I want to invite you to whatever you need to do. But to lean in to this moment and receive it as a gift from God.
Take this fainted heart, take these tainted hands, wash me in your love, come like grace again. Even when my strength is lost, I'll praise you. Even when I have no song, I'll praise you. Even when it's hard to find the words louder, than I'll sing your praise. Ooh, I will only sing your praise. Take this mountain weight, take these ocean tears, hold me through the trial, come like hope again. Even when the fight seems lost, I'll praise you. Even when it hurts like hell, I'll praise you. Even when it makes no sense to sing louder, than I'll sing your praise. Whoa, I will only sing your praise. I will only sing your praise. Oh, I will only sing sing till the morning has come. Lord, my heart burns only for you. You are all I want. And my soul waits only for you. And I will sing till the miracle comes. Yeah. I will only sing your praise. I will only sing your praise. Oh, I will only sing your praise. Even when the morning comes, I'll praise you. Even when the fight is won, I'll praise you. Even when my time on earth is done, louder than I'll sing your praise. Whoa, I will only sing your praise.
I think one of the hardest things to do when we're grieving is to praise God, praise Jesus. But as Chris so awesomely pointed out today, that Jesus knew he was going to raise Lazarus, but he still wept. He still felt the pain. And that's because Jesus hurts when we hurt. He loves us that much. And so I think we need to keep that in mind. Praise him in our pain. We're so thankful that you joined us today. We hope that you've enjoyed this series, that you found it helpful, and that you realize, there's always going to be a point when we're going to say, you know what, things aren't fine. I'm not okay. And so we hope that you found the last 4 weeks helpful. We hope that you can join us next week as we're going to start a new series as we move into the Christmas season, one of my favorite seasons of the year. If you drive around my neighborhood and you see only one house with lights up, you'll know that's mine. And so we hope you have an awesome week, and we look forward to seeing you back next week as we start our new series. Take care, and God bless.